Humor is one of the ways people tell the truth without having to own it. A joke creates distance between the speaker and the feeling, between the word and its consequence. You say the thing, people laugh. And if anyone looks uncomfortable, you shrug and say you were only joking. It is one of the oldest escape hatches in human communication. And most of the time, in most rooms, it works. Before we get into what happened on that Family Feud stage, if stories like this one remind you that some things are too important to laugh off, hit that like button right now and subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story that makes you think. On a Wednesday afternoon in the fall of 2023, a man made a joke on live television that he expected would get a laugh. Steve Harvey did not laugh. He did something that nobody in that studio anticipated, and what he said in response, quietly, without anger, without theatrics, in the measured voice of a man who has seen enough of the world to know the difference between a joke and a wound dressed up as one, stopped the room completely. And what happened after that was something that neither the man who told the joke nor the woman standing beside him would forget for the rest of their lives. Warren and Diane Holloway had been married for 23 years when they came to Family Feud. Warren was 55, a logistics manager from Charlotte, North Carolina, with the broad, easy confidence of a man who had spent decades being good at his job and had allowed that competence to expand gradually into a general confidence about most things. He was funny. That was the first thing most people said about Warren Holloway. He was funny, he was quick, he could work a room. He had the kind of humor that filled silences and smoothed over friction and made people feel at ease, and he had used it so long and so reliably that it had become, for him, less a skill than a reflex. He was also in the way of people who have discovered early that humor is an effective social tool, not always careful about where he aimed it. He joked about his coworkers. Affectionately, he believed. He joked about his children. Lovingly, he maintained. And he joked about Diane regularly in public, with the casual ease of a man who had never once considered that the person the joke was about might be keeping a different account of it than he was. Diane was 52. She had worked as a registered nurse for 25 years, the last 12 of them in a cardiac intensive care unit where the stakes of every decision were as high as stakes could be. She was a woman who had spent her career in the presence of genuine crisis, who had held the hands of people in the worst moments of their lives and had learned, through years of that work, a particular economy with words and emotion. She did not dramatize. She did not perform. She said what she meant when the moment required it, and otherwise conserved her energy for the things that actually mattered. She had, over 23 years of marriage to Warren, developed a practiced tolerance for his humor at her expense. Not a resigned tolerance. She was not a woman who accepted things passively, but the considered, deliberate tolerance of a person who had assessed the full picture and decided that the jokes individually were not worth the cost of addressing. Warren was good in the ways that mattered. He was present, reliable, genuinely loving, and devoted to their family in the practical, consistent manner of a man who showed up every day without being asked. The jokes were a habit, not a character. And Diane had long ago made the calculation that habits could be lived with if the character was sound. What she had not fully accounted for was the accumulation, the way 100 individually survivable things, over 23 years, could gather into a weight that was not individually heavy but collectively significant. Their son Marcus, 26, and daughter Tanya, 23, had organized the Family Feud appearance as a birthday gift for Diane. Marcus had submitted the application. Tanya had handled the logistics. Both of them had done it out of straightforward love. They wanted their mother to have a day that was hers, to be celebrated, to stand in a room where she was simply Diane and not the person who held everyone else together. Tanya, who had inherited her mother's precision and her father's perceptiveness in roughly equal measure, had one quiet reservation about the plan. She had not voiced it to Marcus. It was simply this, that putting her father on a stage with a microphone and an audience was historically a reliable way to generate the kind of jokes that her mother absorbed without comment, and that Tanya had been tracking. With increasing discomfort for most of her adult life, she had hoped she was wrong. She had not been wrong. The family arrived at the studio with the relaxed energy of people who were genuinely looking forward to the afternoon. Warren was in his element from the moment they walked through the door, talking with the production staff, making Tanya laugh in the green room, working the space with the instinctive ease of someone for whom public situations hold no friction. Diane watched him with the affectionate, slightly amused expression she had worn for 23 years. The face of a woman who loves the person she is looking at and has made a complete peace with who that person is, edge cases included. She looked to everyone in that building entirely at ease. But ease in a long marriage can sometimes be indistinguishable from the particular form of distance that develops when a person is stopped expecting certain things to change. The Holloway family was paired against the Petit family from Atlanta, a close-knit group of 3 sisters and their mother, a 74-year-old retired schoolteacher named Josephine who played with the cheerful, unapologetic confidence of a woman who has been the smartest person in most rooms she has entered and sees no reason to pretend otherwise. The Petits were immediately beloved by the audience, and the contest between the 2 families had the warmth and competitive edge that makes for genuinely enjoyable television. Warren was outstanding at the podium. His reflexes were fast, his answers confident, and his natural theatricality played perfectly in the format. He knew how to pause for effect, how to sell a moment, how to make the audience feel included in his thinking. Steve Harvey matched his energy with evident pleasure. They had an easy chemistry, the kind that develops between 2 men who share a particular combination of confidence, a genuine warmth, and their exchanges generated consistent laughter from a crowd that was clearly enjoying itself. Diane played 1 round and was, in the understated manner that characterized everything she did, exceptional. She got the top answer on her face-off with the unruffled precision of a cardiac ICU nurse approaching a problem. She read the question, identified the most likely answer, and gave it without hesitation or performance. Steve Harvey turned to the audience after her second answer landed and said, "She's the closer on this team." "You watch." The audience applauded. Warren, standing nearby, laughed and clapped. He was genuinely proud of her. That was never the question. Marcus and Tanya played their rounds ably. The family was cohesive and warm, and the audience had invested in them, and by the time the Holloways had secured the main game win, a steal in the final round that Warren executed cleanly, the mood in the studio was high. Warren was visibly delighted. He had performed well, the family had performed well, and the plan had produced the intended result. Steve Harvey was moving through the pregame setup for Fast Money, the light, conversational transition that preceded the final round, when he turned to the Holloway family and offered Warren the question he had been extending to long-married husbands all season, 23 years. "Tell me the one thing about this woman that has made you a better man." It was a generous question, an invitation to say something true and good about the person beside him in front of his children and 300 strangers, with no wrong answer available as long as the answer was sincere. Warren smiled. He had the answer ready before Steve had finished asking, the way people have answers ready when they have been saying a version of the same thing for years. "Diane keeps me humble," he said. "Every time I think I know something, she reminds me I don't. Every time I think I've got a situation handled," he laughed and gestured at his wife, "she finds the 17 things I missed." He was still smiling. "Honestly, living with her is like having a full-time quality control department. Nothing gets past her." The audience laughed. It was a familiar kind of laugh, the warm, slightly uncomfortable laugh of a crowd that found the joke funny enough and was not entirely sure whether the woman it was about was also finding it funny. They looked at Diane. Diane was smiling. It was the right smile, the one she had refined over 23 years, warm and composed and giving nothing away. She had heard versions of this joke at dinner parties, at family gatherings, at work events, where Warren had held court and she had stood beside him and absorbed it, because the cost of not absorbing it in a room full of people was higher than she was willing to pay. This time in this room, there were 300 people watching her absorb it, and one of them was Tanya, who was not smiling at all. Steve Harvey had not laughed. He had been standing with the easy posture of a host between moments, and in the space of about 2 seconds, without moving dramatically, his posture changed. Not stiffened, settled. The way a person settles when they have decided to stop moving and address something. He looked at Warren. He looked at Diane. He looked at the smile on Diane's face that was not quite reaching her eyes. And then he said in a voice that was entirely without performance, "Warren, tell me something real." The studio went quiet. Warren's smile held for a moment, recalibrating. "That was real," he said, with the mild defensiveness of a man who has not yet understood that the conversation has changed registers. "That was funny," Steve said, not unkindly, with the directness of a man making a distinction that mattered. "I know the difference. You know the difference, and I think your wife knows the difference better than either of us." He paused. "Tell me something real about this woman. Not a joke, the truth." Warren looked at Steve Harvey. He looked at Diane. He looked at his children. At Marcus, who was watching him with an expression that was carefully neutral, and at Tanya, whose expression was not neutral at all. And in the silence that followed, something shifted in Warren Holloway's face that had nothing to do with performance. Steve Harvey waited. He had the particular patience of a man who has learned that the most important things in a room are usually waiting just beneath the first response, and that the way to reach them is not to push, but to hold, to create. With silence and steadiness, the conditions in which a person can find their way to something true. Warren was quiet for several seconds. It was a different kind of quiet from his usual register. Not the quiet of a man collecting his next line, but the quiet of a man who has been asked to go somewhere he does not often go, and is deciding, in real time, whether he is willing. When he spoke, his voice was different. The performance had stepped back. What was left was something plainer and more honest and considerably more difficult to say. "Diane kept our family together," he said, "not in the background, at the center. When I was traveling for work and the kids were young, she was running everything. When my mother got sick and I was handling that and the job at the same time, she managed this house and those 2 children and never once asked me to do more than I could." When I went through that period, he stopped. And something moved across his face that was private and significant, and that his children recognized immediately the period about 8 years ago when I wasn't doing well. She didn't leave. She didn't even threaten to. She just stayed, and she got us through it, and she never used it against me. Not once. He stopped again. He pressed his lips together. "I make jokes about her because it's easier than saying what I just said. Because saying what I just said out loud in front of people means admitting that I would not be standing here without her." And I think he looked at Diane, and his voice dropped, not in volume but in register, becoming something that was meant only for her, even though 300 people were hearing it. "I think I have hidden behind the jokes because saying the real thing felt like giving up some ground I didn't know how to give up. And that was not fair to you. Any of it. Not the jokes, and not the silence behind them." Diane was looking at her husband with an expression that was the most complex thing in the room. It was not the practiced composure she had maintained all afternoon. It was something rawer than that, and more careful, the expression of a woman hearing something she had waited a long time to hear, and was not yet certain she had permission to fully receive. "What period?" Marcus said quietly. From the side of the stage, he was not asking Warren. He was asking the room. 8 years ago, he had been 18, and there were things about that year that he had understood imperfectly and filed away and never fully examined. Diane glanced at her son and then back at Warren. Warren nodded slightly. An acknowledgement, a permission. Steve Harvey had been standing quietly through all of it, doing what he did in his best moments, nothing, holding the space open, refusing to fill it, allowing the room to be as large as the truth required. He spoke now, and his voice held the tone of a man who has been entrusted with something and understands the weight of the trust. "Warren," he said, "what you just did took more courage than anything that happened in this game today. You went to a place most men in this situation would have redirected away from. And I want to tell you something. He paused. The joke you made a few minutes ago, I've heard 1,000 versions of it. Husband makes a joke about the wife, audience laughs, everybody moves on, and the wife stands there and smiles and absorbs it, and nobody asks whether she's okay with absorbing it, and most of the time nobody ever will. Another pause. But what you just said, that the jokes were hiding something you did not know how to say out loud. That is the most honest thing a man can say in a marriage, because it means you knew there was something real under the humor, and you chose the humor because it was safer. And admitting that in front of your children, in front of your wife, is how you stop choosing it. He turned to Diane. You have been standing beside this man's humor for 23 years, he said gently. What do you want to say to him? Diane looked at Warren for a long moment. Then she said with the economy of a woman who does not waste words, I know who you are, Warren. Under the jokes I have always known. I just needed you to know that I know, and that I need to hear it sometimes, not in private, out loud. Warren nodded slowly. I hear you, he said. He said it without embellishment because he meant it as a commitment and not a performance, and she understood the difference. And the audience could see that she understood the difference. Tanya had been crying quietly for several minutes. Marcus had his arm around her. Steve Harvey looked at the two of them, at the adult children witnessing their parents arrive, in public and in real time, at a truth that had been circling the household for years, and said, that's your parents. That's the whole of them. Right there. Hold on to that. He turned to the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, I asked this man to stop being funny and start being honest. And he did it. That is not a small thing. Every person in a long relationship knows how much easier it is to make a joke than to say the real thing. Warren chose the real thing today, in front of everybody. He paused. I hope he keeps choosing it. I think he will. The ovation was immediate and warm and entirely sincere. Warren reached for Diane's hand. She gave it without hesitation, not as resolution, because resolution takes longer than an afternoon, but as presence, as the gesture of a woman who is still here, who has always been here, and who is now, for the first time in a long time, standing somewhere she can be seen. The Holloway family played fast money. Diane and Tanya took the 2 spots, which Marcus later said was the only correct choice, and that he had insisted on it before the round was assigned. Between them, they scored 198 points, 2 short of the $20,000, and the 2-point margin produced the kind of groan that an audience reserves for genuinely heartbreaking near misses. Warren laughed with the full-throated ease of a man who had just laid something down and felt lighter for it. Diane laughed too, leaning her head briefly against his shoulder before straightening. It was a small gesture, the kind that contains decades. The episode aired 5 weeks later. The production team made the decision, consistent with their approach to the most significant exchanges of the season, to air the full conversation without editorial scaffolding. Warren's joke, Steve's pause, the full arc, drew Warren's admission and Diane's reply. The response was large and swift, and had, as the exchanges in the series had increasingly demonstrated, a character that went well beyond entertainment engagement. What traveled furthest and lasted longest was Warren's explanation that the jokes were hiding something he did not know how to say out loud. That specific formulation, the acknowledgement that humor had been functioning as concealment rather than connection, reached something in a substantial number of people who had been on both sides of that dynamic. Men wrote about recognizing the mechanism Warren had described, the reflex of deflecting into humor when sincerity felt too exposed. Women wrote about the particular experience of being the consistent target of a joke that was never actually about them, that was about the joker's discomfort with vulnerability, their own worth simply providing the convenient cover. The distinction, when Warren named it, was immediately legible to people who had felt it without having the language for it. Steve Harvey addressed the exchange on his radio program with his characteristic directness, and what he said was more personal than his usual reflection on these moments. Warren Holloway did something I want to talk about specifically. He said, because it's something I understand from the inside, there's a kind of man, and I have been this kind of man, who uses humor to manage intimacy, who has learned that being funny is safer than being earnest, because funny people get to control the room, and earnest people have to be vulnerable in the room. And when that man is in a marriage, the humor becomes a pattern, a habit, and the person on the receiving end of it learns to absorb it because the alternative is confronting something hurt. The husband cannot yet confront himself. He paused. Warren got there on a game show stage in front of 300 people because I asked him a second time and held the silence long enough that the joke couldn't survive it. I want every man watching to know, you don't need a game show. You need to ask yourself once whether the joke is actually what you mean, and if it isn't, say what you mean. He added, Diane Holloway is a cardiac ICU nurse. She has spent her career in the presence of the most serious possible human circumstances. She chose to spend her life beside a funny man, and she loved him for it. And she absorbed the jokes for 23 years. She was not asking him to stop being funny. She was asking him to also be honest. Those are not mutually exclusive. And Warren found out they were not mutually exclusive. I hope other people find that out before their wife has to smile through 23 years of evidence. For Warren and Diane, the months following the taping were a period of deliberate adjustment. Warren had left the studio that afternoon with something he described in a conversation with Marcus a few weeks later as a feeling of having been turned around and pointed in the right direction. He was not suddenly a different kind of man. He was still funny. That was not going anywhere. And Diane had never wanted it to go anywhere. What changed was the relationship between the humor and the honesty. He began consciously and with the specific effort of a man retraining a reflex to notice when he was reaching for a joke in a moment that deserved something else. Not every time. Old habits do not dissolve overnight, but consistently enough that Diane noticed and told him. She noticed. And that exchange, repeated in small variations over months, became its own form of intimacy. Tanya called her mother 6 weeks after the episode aired and asked a question she had been holding for a while. Did you know before that afternoon that it was going to take something like that for Dad to say what he said? Diane was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I knew there was something under the jokes. I have always known. What I did not know was whether he knew. She paused. Now we both know. And that changes things. Tanya, who had spent years tracking the dynamic with growing discomfort and no clear outlet for it, said that watching her father find his way to honesty on that stage had done something for her own understanding of him that she had not anticipated. I was angry at him for a long time, she told Marcus, not in an obvious way, quietly, for the way he talked about Mom in public, for the way she always had to absorb it. And I think the anger was also partly because I didn't understand why he did it. Why someone who loved her as much as he clearly did would keep doing it. She paused, and then he explained it. He explained it in front of everybody. And the explanation was so honest and so human and so recognizable because I have done versions of the same thing, deflecting into humor when sincerity feels too exposed. That the anger didn't survive, but it just went, another pause. That was a gift. A strange place to give it, but a gift. The clip's reach extended into context that spoke to the specific mechanism Warren had named. A behavioral therapist specializing in relationship communication wrote an essay for a professional journal using Warren's explanation as an illustration of what she termed affectionate deflection, the pattern by which humor is deployed in long relationships not to harm, but to avoid the vulnerability that sincere expression requires. The essay was shared widely outside its professional context, which was unusual because it gave precise clinical language to something that a very large number of people had experienced without knowing what to call it. Several readers wrote to the journal to say that the essay had prompted the first honest conversation about humor and intimacy they had ever had with their partner. Steve Harvey was asked, in an interview nearly a year after the episode aired, whether he had known when he said, "Tell me something real," that Warren would find his way to what he actually said. Harvey thought about it for a moment. "No," he said. "I knew there was more there." I could see it in his face when he made the joke, the slight hesitation before the punchline, the way he glanced at his wife just for a second before committing to it. A man who is genuinely comfortable with a joke doesn't check whether it landed. He checked. That told me he knew. What I didn't know was how far down the real thing went. That period he mentioned eight years ago, I did not see that coming. So when it came out, I just stepped back and let it happen. Because that was bigger than anything I could have asked for, and it needed to breathe. Warren and Diane Holloway returned to Charlotte. Warren is still funny. The family still laughs at dinner, still tells the same stories from childhood that get funnier with retelling. Still operates with the warmth of a household built by a man who knows how to fill a room. What is different in the years since the taping is the texture of what sits alongside the humor. There is more earnestness now, more moments where Warren says the real thing instead of the deflecting thing. Not because the deflecting thing is no longer available to him, but because he has learned slowly, with effort, in the manner of a genuine habit change, to notice when it is the wrong tool for the moment in front of him. Diane has told Tanya in one of their regular phone calls that what she feels most is not vindication. "I was never waiting to be proven right," she said. "I knew who he was. I've always known who he was. What I feel is relieved that we don't have to talk around it anymore. That the thing that was between us is now something we can both see and both name. That is not nothing." She stopped. "That is actually quite a lot." The last thing Steve Harvey said to the Holloway family before the taping concluded and the family's move toward the exits was not to Warren. It was to Diane. He found her near the stage exit and said quietly, without cameras, "You have been patient with that man for a long time. I hope he knows that." Diane smiled, the real one, the one that reached all the way. "He's getting there," she said. Steve Harvey nodded. "They usually do," he said, "when someone loves them enough to wait. If this story reached something in you, if it brought to mind a joke you have been telling that is actually something else, or a truth, you have been waiting for someone to find the courage to say, please share it. Hit the like button, subscribe to this channel, and pass it along to someone who needs to hear it. Because the real thing, when it finally gets said, is always worth the wait, and it is never too late to say it."